the siege of Fort William Henry, a battle which ended in a massacre, made famous by the last of the Mohicans. During the French and Indian War, England and France were fighting for control of North America. In August of 1757, the hostilities centered around Lake George in the New York frontier. The French, under the command of the Marquis de Montcalm, assembled an army of 8,000 men, including 1,800 Indians from more than 30 nations. They traveled south and laid siege to Fort William Henry. The French artillery bombarded the fort, while their Indian allies attacked the encampment to the southeast. After 6 long days, the men in Fort William Henry could no longer defend their position. On August 9th, they raised the white flag and asked to capitulate. The French negotiated the terms of surrender without input from their Indian allies. As part of the agreement, the British were allowed to surrender with the honors of war. The men would keep their belongings and be escorted to Fort Edward by a French detachment the following day. Around midday, the capitulation was signed. Almost immediately, the Indians and Canadians surrounded the fort, eager to obtain the spoils of war which were promised for their participation in this campaign.
The Indians did not delay to strike their blow. They penetrated into the place in crowds through the embrasures of the cannon for the purpose of proceeding to the pillage, which it had been agreed to give up to them.
The Indians swarmed through the fort, taking what rewards they could. As the garrison in the fort moved to the camp, the Indians turned their attention there, unhappy that the British were allowed to keep their belongings.
The English troops were to remain in their entrenched camp until the next day. Despite a guard from our troops, the Indians could not be stopped from entering and pillaging.
They were all this day very troublesome, stealing the baggage of the officers and whatever they could lay their hands on.
Everything was done to stop them. We will be most fortunate if we can avoid a massacre.
By nightfall, order was finally restored in the encampment. To prevent any further trouble, it was decided that the British should march to Fort Edward that night. This order was quickly rescinded when it was discovered that many of the Indians were not in their camp.
The savages, not satisfied with the plunder that they had got in the morning, intended to attack us on our march. It was more advisable we should remain until the morning.
The men in the encampment spent a disagreeable night under the protection of 100 French regulars. The following morning, the British and provincials eagerly prepared for their departure. They found the Indians had not lost interest in them during the night.
Early this morning, we were ordered to prepare for our march, but found the Indians in a worse temper, if possible, than last night. Every one having a tomahawk, hatchet, or some other instrument of death.
The Indians flocked around the encampment, climbed over the breastwork, and moved about the camp in a menacing display. They demanded the British turn over their valuables.
These demands were made in a tone which announced that the thrust of the spear would be the price of a refusal.
The British implored the French guards for help.
At all events, the French troops who we thought were sent to protect us were of no assistance, and advised giving up our effects rather than dispute with the savages.
The men threw down their possessions, hoping to abate the anger of the Indians, without success. They continued to strip the British, taking hats, swords, and clothing, leaving many naked and confusion to overrun the encampment. Then they turned to the hospital tents.
The Indian doctors began with their tomahawks to cure the sick and the wounded.
The horrid cruelties committed upon these unhappy wretches before our faces terrified us to the greatest degree imaginable.
As the pillaging and slaughter went on in the encampment, the British regulars finally began their march.
At last, with great difficulty, the troops got from the retrenchment, but they were no sooner out than the savages fell upon the rear, killing and scalping.
Woe to those who closed the march. or to the stragglers whom illness or any other reason separated ever so little from the main body. They were as good as dead, and their lifeless bodies soon strewed the ground.
The sound of the attack at the rear caused confusion at the front of the line, causing the march to halt. Once the men in the front realized the attack, they began hurriedly marching again, only adding to the turmoil.
They discharged right and left heavy blows with their hatchets on those who came within their reach.
The terrified British and provincials fled the encampment.
A crowd of unhappy beings running about at random, some towards the woods, others towards the tents of the French, these towards the fort, those towards places which seemed to promise them an asylum. Such were the pitiable objects which presented themselves to my eyes.
The Indians pursued, tearing the children from their mothers' bosoms and their mothers from their husbands, then singling out the men, carrying them in the woods and killing a great many whom we saw lying on the roadside.
This horrid scene of blood and slaughter obliged our officers to apply to the officers of the French Guard for protection, which they refused, and told them they must take to the woods and shift for themselves.
The French were not by any means indolent spectators or insensible to this catastrophe. The Chevalier de Lévis ran in all directions where the tumult seemed most violent. The French and Canadian officers imitated his example.
The French, it is true, had a detachment of their men drawn up as is mentioned in the capitulation, but their only business was to receive the plunder by the savages.
What avail were 400 men against about 1,500 furious Indians who could scarcely distinguish us from the enemy? One of our sergeants, who had opposed himself bravely to their violence, was struck to the earth by the blow of a spear.
The chaos surrounding the march from the encampment caused much confusion. Men, women, and children were carried off as prisoners. Some were stripped of their clothing and belongings, while others fled for their safety.
The Indians followed above halfway to Fort Edward, and most of the officers and many of the soldiers chose to remain with the French for protection.
As the British fled and the French intervened on their behalf, the Indian attack came to an end. The attack only lasted a few minutes, but the swiftness and frenzy of the day's events have come to overshadow the 6 days of the siege.
The number killed during the siege did not exceed 80, of which 10 were killed in the fort. The number killed on the road to Fort Edward is uncertain, as many were butchered in the woods and bushes. Near 30 carcasses, however, were actually seen, and from the frequent stenches they met, had reason to imagine many more lay scattered about.
If you want to see more videos like this in the future, hit the subscribe button. If you're interested in purchasing the full-length documentary that this clip is from, head over to my website, eks.tv.